good evening, everybody. Thrilled to have the opportunity to talk with you this evening. I'm Ali Oliver, Chief Exec of the Youth Sport Trust. And tonight is another session as part of your athlete education programme. And this session is particularly focused on life alongside sport and what that means to have a life alongside sport, and what does that mean in terms of your sport and its impact on your life. Now, I'm not going to be delivering all of this session on my own. I'm being very ably supported by a couple of the athlete mentors from the School Games National Finals, and I'm thrilled to introduce them. But in introducing them by name, I'm going to ask them both to just introduce themselves by way of their own performance career, perhaps their experiences as a mentor, and anything else they want to add at this point on life along side sport before we get started. So I'll invite Louise Hunt, one of our wheelchair tennis players, to introduce herself first.
So hi everyone, my name is Louise, as you now know. I'm a wheelchair tennis player and I competed in the London 2012 Paralympic Games and also Rio as well. My highest ever world ranking was number 10 in the world, reached number 2 in the world in juniors. I'm now actually retired. I retired very recently actually, and very much enjoying that retirement after a career that I'm pretty proud of. Now I'm out of it, I can see that I'm happy with what I've achieved, but very happy to be on the other side of it now and loving being a mentor for the Youth Sport Trust.
Thanks so much, Louise. Thrilled to have you, and really, really do appreciate your time, not only on this session, but throughout the school games as well. Tom, over to you. Tom Davis, judo athlete.
Yeah, you've introduced me already. Yeah, so yeah, my name's Tom Davis. I'm a former GB Judo international. I suppose best results were British Commonwealth champion and be reserved for 2 Olympic Games. Now, since then, transitioned out of the world of sport into what I would consider the real world. And like Louise said, really passionate about supporting young people and anyone we can get in front of as an athlete mentor for the Youth Sport Trust.
Brilliant, and thank you, Tom, too, for your time. We're really incredibly lucky to have former athletes on this session, particularly because when we talk about life alongside sport, there's obviously the issues when you're performing and you're in the midst of your performance career, but also quite a lot of life alongside sport is all about how you're managing other things in your life, so that at some point, whenever retirement comes, there is still a life left. So it's great to have both Louise and Tom on that. So just through the session here, I'm going to be showing some slides so you can follow some words on the screen, I guess, and a few bits of stimuli and images, but we'll be flicking backwards and forwards between the gallery as well. So life alongside sport is our theme, and really what we are, I guess, hoping to get across here is that there is opportunity for you to have a symbiotic relationship between your sport and your life. And what I mean by that is that things in your life are managed in a way that they don't negatively impact on your sport, and indeed perhaps ideally they can optimize your sport performance if you manage your life and your lifestyle in the best way. But also, just a link to that is that your sport can enrich your life, and you can get more out of life because of the skills that you're acquiring through your sport, the relationships, the networks, the experiences, and so on. So it really is this two-way relationship between life and sport. And I'm going to talk through 3 sections. The first section we're going to spend probably about 10 minutes to 15 minutes on is the choices that you will probably have to make if you're not already making them, but the issues, the challenges, the demands that will inevitably come onto you as someone who is trying to not just live their life and perhaps get through an education or consider a future employment, but you're also trying to hold down a performance career alongside it. So it's a given, isn't it, that you are going to have these demands. There's no way that you can aspire to do everything you're doing without having extra things to do, extra pressures on your time, extra considerations in relation to other people who perhaps don't have that sport career alongside them. The question is do you see those demands and addressing those demands and managing them and handling them about a series of sacrifices or a series of positive choices? And the difference there is sacrifice is something perhaps rather begrudgingly, perhaps you feel I'm missing out on that if I make this decision. as opposed to a positive choice where I'm actively involved in that decision-making process. This is what I want to do. And therefore, it's not a sacrifice at all. It's actually accepting the opportunity that lies in front of me. And then thirdly, I'm going to use the scales analogy quite a lot through this session. It's about exploring where you sit in making those choices or those sacrifices. How much of this is under your ownership and your control are you taking responsibility of, or how much of this actually is happening around you? And at the moment, at this stage, there are some things that are happening in your life or sport where you're not directly in control of. And that's a really, really important point that we want to consider. So I'm going to straight away, I'm going to bring Louise in straight away on particularly that middle point about sacrifice and choice. I've read it many places. I've seen it in action sometimes, described in different ways. But Louise, how do you see the things that you've had to wrestle with in your career?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting topic, and the power of words, because actually we're kind of talking about the same thing, but some people perceive that as a sacrifice, some it's a choice. Personally, I always, when I was actually competing, I always saw all those things as a choice. And actually, one of the things that made me realise that I was ready to retire and finish competing was because they turned into sacrifices for me. So actually, when I was younger and competing, I was making a choice to miss out on, like, you know, I suppose you could say the fun stuff, the birthday parties, the socializing, all those kind of things, because I was away competing. But for me, it was a choice that I was willing to make. And actually, it really did outweigh that because I was so dedicated and focused on what I was doing. I almost didn't mind, if that makes sense. And actually, I say interestingly, but later in life, it was like, actually, now I've got to a point where this matters a bit more to me and it feels like a sacrifice. So now I kind of know that this is the right choice for me. But I think as well, like, you know, being an athlete, something I would say, if it's something that you're super passionate about and you're willing to commit 100% to, the things that it can bring you are phenomenal. And as we all know, being an athlete isn't necessarily a lifelong career. Yes, you can do things like Tom and I, you know, with the athlete mentor role, where we've kind of used our experiences into another job, but the actual athletic part of your career probably isn't going to be lifelong. So I personally felt that they were worth it. I don't know if Tom agrees with me or not on that one.
What do you think, Theo? I think it's a really great way of looking at it, Louise, actually, about that transition from your competitive career into retirement, and when things failed to become positive choices that you were making, I guess, in the spirit of what you really, really wanted, and they sort of started to compromise other things in your life that weren't what you were wanting. Has it been said, Tom?
Yeah, I definitely agree, because ultimately, I think everything, when you're so involved in sport and you kind of got this unshakable belief and drive to achieve your own personal ambitions, it is kind of that one where everything, all the choices you make are about being the best athlete you can be. And so for me, a lot of those times, when it came down to choices about, I don't know, whether it was missing out on an event or missing out on birthday celebrations or family events, it was often an easy choice for me, because when you weigh up what it is you want to achieve in life, and like Louise said, it is a small window of opportunity to kind of be the best athlete you can be in the sports that we've chosen. So for me, it was definitely slightly easier to make those choices. And for me, don't get me wrong, you do miss out on things, and you do kind of not always have the opportunity to do the things that your friends or your peers that are not involved in high performance sport are doing. But ultimately, if the drive and what you want to achieve kind of is great enough, I think those choices become that little bit easier. And ultimately, if it, like Louise did, when it turns into a sacrifice and something you're not enjoying, making those choices, then ultimately you got to sit down and have those long, hard conversations with yourself. Because ultimately, I think happy athletes obviously perform better and have much more long-lived and fulfilling careers within sport. So ultimately, it's really recognizing who you are and why you're making those choices. So understanding yourself that little bit better, so you can make good choices for you.
That's a great point. It's knowing what's really important to you. And I guess, correct me if I'm wrong here, but both of you aren't necessarily saying that all the way through your performance career, your competitive career, you had to make choices away from things that I guess competed with training or with competition. And there must have been times where you actually made positive choices to put your competition or your training on hold because of some other things. So it isn't a case of at this stage that these young athletes are at now, they've got to make all choices in the interests of their sport, because as you say, Tom, you're a human being, you've got your own motives and drives, and from time to time you might compromise a little bit on what's right for your sport, because it's kind of in your wider interests and keeping you happy is what the word you just used, Tom, was kind of a happy athlete is a successful athlete.
Yeah, for me, definitely. I mean, I studied alongside my sporting career, and even though I took an awful long time to get my degree, and that was kind of a conscious choice to make sure that it didn't impact my sporting aspirations as much. But there was definitely pinch points where I suppose sport went to the back burner for that conscious decision for my own personal development and life after sport and life alongside sport in terms of education. So definitely.
I think just to follow on from that, because I also studied and worked alongside my sport too, and it's certainly about balance, getting the balance right and prioritizing. Ali, you're spot on in that. Yeah, sometimes there was times where things at home would be prioritized over sport because they were more important in those moments, and that's also okay. It's okay for now and again to be actually, sport can take a backseat just for now because this is more important, as long as you get that balance right. So yeah, I think it's about priorities, isn't it? But your priorities change throughout your life, and I think it's important that everyone knows that's okay as well. It's just about being true to yourself and really reflecting on how do I feel about this right now, which is more important to me. Am I aware of what could have consequences on either side if I pick this choice over this choice? But at the end of the day, I don't know if there's right or wrong decisions. It's just the ones that work best for you.
Yeah, and that's a brilliant point. Life is too short sometimes to be regretful of decisions that we might have made that, had we made a different decision, the outcome might have been slightly better. Is actually all of our lives, and particularly as athletes, it's about moving forward and evaluating all the information you have to hand, making what you think is the right decision. And if it isn't the right decision, how you take that learning with you forward rather than letting it, I guess, hold you back. Okay, let's take a minute as a group, I suppose, those of you that are watching in either live now or on demand afterwards. I'd just like you to think about your competing demands and what they might be. So if you have a note paper in front of you, you can scribble these down or scribble those down, I should say, that come into your own head. Here are some that I thought of. And again, Tom and Louise, just feel free to chip in if any of these you disagree with, you don't think they're choices, or any that you want to add to it. So I've kind of got the sport friend things that Louise has touched on, the training and education, which Tom's talked about there, extending the course of his studies to be able to maintain his training. Could be a tension here between school sport and club sport, particularly if your school is a strong school at your sport and they want to make sure that their very best players are competing for the school team. But is that in your interest as an athlete if you have club competition coming up, which may be more significant or a higher standard than the school sport? That can often feel like a tension. Injury and training. I'm wondering how many of you out there have trained through an injury because you've been fearful of missing out on a training session. So you trained through an injury, and that can create a real competing demand. If I miss that training session, am I going to be behind? Equally, if I rest up for an injury for too long, am I going to be fit enough to get back to competing? This would definitely be a difficult one for me. Eating healthily against eating what you crave. Again, it's just a healthy tension, isn't it? Sometimes eating foods that perhaps aren't very healthy for us, but in small amounts can improve our mood and make us feel good. But if we eat them too often, obviously we have an impact on their health. Parents and coaches' views on how you play. Louise, Tom, did either of you have any tensions between parental or carer pressure and expectations or methodology of coaching and your coach? You've both got smiles on, so I wonder if you have anything to share on that.
I just look at your face, Tom. Well, do you know what? So personal experience, I have to be honest, I feel like the luckiest girl in the world because I personally never experienced that. However, I've had a lot of experience with fellow athletes, not just in tennis actually, but in other sports where, parents versus coach has been quite an area of tension. And I've really felt for the athlete because they very much felt in the middle. And I mean, I haven't had this personal experience. I'll be interested to hear if Tom's had it, but I can't imagine that balance because that's two very crucial, you know, relationships in your life that you want to manage as best as you possibly can. So, but like I say, I've been alongside people, and it's really, really caused a lot of issues and actually really affected their performance. My heart's gone out to them, but yeah, maybe Tom might be a better place to, I don't know if he's got any experiences that he's had with it.
No. I was just smiling because I can't imagine. Sorry, my mum's not got a judo background, so my mum giving me coaching tips probably wouldn't have been the the greatest advice. No offense, bless her, you know. But anyway, it was probably potentially more just around her conflict from, say, wanting to make sure I kind of achieved within education. If I had a competition, I was going away. Potentially, there might have been a slight challenge, but to be honest, I think she understood, and that actually I got so much from sport, and I got so much from the opportunity of being able to do judo with my club and actually traveling abroad, etc. That the benefits far outweighed the negatives. So I can't say there was any kind of conflict between my mum. I just imagine her trying to tell my coach how to teach me to do a judo move.
But it happens though, right, Tom? It does happen.
Yeah,
I've heard of parents trying to give coaches advice, and like you just said, no, none of that sporting background at all. And you got to feel for the coach in that situation. You really have, because they got to keep the peace, right? But oh gosh, I can't even imagine. I'd love to my mum teach me tennis too. I actually might just ask her for it, just for a laugh.
Yeah. I think it's gone full circle for me now as I sit on the sidelines and watch my kids do judo. I'm definitely not in that kind of conflict phase. They're fully enjoying just participating in the local club. So definitely no interference from me.
One thing that comes across really clearly, Tom, as you talk there, is about your mum recognising how important sport was to you and how much you were getting from it. And I think, you know, again, just for us all reflecting at the moment, if you are one of those individual athletes who's got sort of tension between parental expectations, aspirations, or views on the sport and the coach, so much of this is helped in its management by talking. So for your mum to know that you got so much from judo, Tom, you must have shown that. You must have shown her, you know, that you were happy, you were enjoying it, you would have talked about it, you would have expressed how it made you feel. And you know, it's a very difficult one to balance, actually, trying to manage a parental relationship, particularly when they're still largely often responsible for funding us, transporting us, you know, giving us the opportunities that we have to work with them. But involving your parents in your sport by sharing as much as you can about how it makes you feel, as well as how it's making them feel in terms of their pride and desire for you to do the very best you can do, is a really important one. Thank you both for sharing your experiences there. I just got one more, which is I think probably slightly more apparent now than perhaps in the past, just because of the narrative around athletes at the moment. This tension between self-worth and performance. And I don't know if any of those viewing saw the BBC programme Gold Rush, which tracked the performance of Team GB, Paralympics GB, from Atlanta in '96 up until the Rio Games, and was projecting forward to Tokyo. It was aired just before Tokyo. And it was talking about the levels of public investment in performance sport and how much medals cost, and all of the amazing opportunities that are now available to our athletes thanks to the investment of national lottery funding and the more professionalized approach to performance sport, can sometimes create a tension in athletes between, am I valued as a human being and someone who has talent and has worked really hard to hone my talent and be extraordinary on the field of play? Or am I just a receipt for an investment? And am I just a point on a league table or a medal table? So for some athletes, and particularly later on, we're going to talk a little bit about emotional well-being and mental health, but that competing demand about, why am I doing this? And am I doing it for the reasons that make sense to me, or am I doing it for other people? And as I go further up the performance ladder, where the stakes are higher, there are more people involved and who have a stake in my performance, do I start to lose a little bit of control of it? And again, I'm just going to reflect back to Tom and Louise. Don't feel the need to comment on these things, but I wonder whether any of those sorts of changes occurred during your careers as athletes, from sort of more us being proud as a nation to have competitors taking part in world championships, Olympic, Paralympic, Commonwealth Games, to actually, unless you medalled, you know, it's not all that great, folks, because really shouldn't our athletes in return for that investment be medaling?
Want to go ahead, Tom, this time?
You start on this one. I'll give this to you.
Okay. Well, it's interesting. So I'll share a kind of personal part of my journey, which as soon as you started chatting there, Ali, just reminded me of a time in my life. So I went through quite a difficult stage in my career. And when we talk about the balance between performance and expectations versus self-worth. Now, in 2016, I had the best year of my career. I'd reached the highest ever world ranking I got to. I was beating players I'd never beaten before. I'd got to my second Paralympic Games pretty comfortably. And I'd had the best year of my career. It was just really good progress. And I had, after the Games, all of my funding taken away because I wasn't a medalist. And as much as obviously I get how those things work, you know, the business side of sport and how funding comes in. When I had that meeting and obviously had all that funding taken away, bear in mind this had been my career my entire life. You know, I was 25 years old. I didn't really know much else. I had been doing things alongside, like Tom, I studied and worked and things, but this was my whole income, it's my whole job. It was a pretty difficult thing to deal with because instantly you realise that who you are actually didn't make a difference in that moment. Now, I came away from that meeting and took a lot of time to reflect because obviously my first initial reaction was my career's over. But I took some time and realised it's absolutely not over because that isn't anybody else's choice but my own. I still loved tennis. I still had a passion for tennis and I knew I had so much more to give. So I actually left that meeting, gave it some time, and then I went to my current sponsors and told them what had happened, and they were amazing and they upped my funding, and I got a job. It was part-time, and I fully have up until I retired this year, I fully funded my whole tennis program for 5 years, because I don't want anyone to think this is about, like, you know, being funded is wonderful, absolutely aspire to that, you know, being a part of a performance program is an honor, but after a really tough time, I then realized that actually I am good enough and I want this, and I'm not going to let somebody else determine my worth that way. I hope that makes sense. So it's something that I'm proud of that I managed to achieve, but that was really difficult, and that was a moment in my career where my self-worth hit rock bottom, because actually I'd done really well and I thought I'd been doing all right, but I wasn't quite good enough, you know, to reach those expectations. But that didn't mean I had to stop, and that didn't mean I had to stop trying to aspire and drive towards my goals. And I'm really pleased I didn't, and I'm really pleased that I continued for as long as I felt it was right and stopped when I felt I was comfortable. But it is really tough because obviously results are, you know, they are important in when it comes to funding and things like that. That's how the world works. But I really feel that if you give 110%, work as hard as you can, and know that you can honestly sit there and say to yourself, I did everything, I think you have to be comfortable with that, because that's what luckily I had an incredible support system around me that made me realize, actually, unfortunately, it's how the system works sometimes, but you did do everything, and I can sit there and go, okay, like I did well, what else could I have done? I'm proud of myself, I have no regrets, but this is what I'm going to do to move forward. So I had quite a personal experience of feeling that tension, but I'm pleased to say that I didn't give up just because of that. But like I say, those things happen, but don't let that scare you off, guys. Don't let that scare you off, because it's not always like, you know, like every funding body works differently. Of course there's different rules, of course they need to fund, you know, the athlete's most potential. That is just how it works. But like I say, work hard, give it all you've got. What else can you possibly do? And sport, Tom mentioned it earlier, sport brings you so many incredible things at any level, and I will forever be grateful for it. And it's interesting, Ali, looking at your point about sport versus friends. Now, I'm incredibly fortunate. I had amazing friends, you know, outside of sport that have got me to where I have been amazing. But some of the best friends I've met in the world, I met my fiance through sport. You know, sport brings you the love of your life. It brings you friends. It can bring you so many more things. So it's an incredible thing, but I will forever be grateful for, regardless of those, you know, difficult times.
Well, it's great. It's great that you've shared that with us, Louise, because I think it's a real life example of how an athlete goes from feeling out of control of the situation, that those who were, I guess, investing in you were suddenly in control of your career, and they had made a decision about whether you were to be funded. And initially the interpretation of that is, well, that's the end of my career, instead of, you know, your own personal responsibility and ambition and desire being, no, I love this sport and I've still got things to prove, and I can still, it's a really important one, again, as young athletes, particularly through a system where you're desperately trying to meet the expectations of the system and fit in and progress through it, sometimes your own agenda might get lost in that, and keeping your own flame burning while you do this. And you know, if the only reason you do it is because you like the hardware, you want the medals, then that's a personal choice as well. That's absolutely fine. But it's just knowing in your own mind and keeping that crystal clear, particularly as your world evolves as an athlete. There are more and more people with a vested interest in performance, and they can tug and cause those tensions. So Tom, it was really, if you wanted to add anything to that, really, whether that sort of tension between what you're worth as a person and what you're worth as a performer have ever been experienced in your career.
Yeah, I mean, it's lots of athletes have had these stories, and it's very similar in terms of that kind of potentially you become a commodity as soon as you're started paid to be able to do the sport that you love, and there's always a line, and sometimes you are the right side of the line and get the selections and get obviously the support that you want or you're aspiring to get, and sometimes you're the wrong side, and often that can be quite challenging to take. I mean, for me personally, I was always really appreciative of the opportunity, because ultimately I was kind of a little bit of a late bloomer, and so for instance I never ever thought as a teenager I'd ever be even in a position to be able to compete for Great Britain as a senior and actually progress and travel the world and do something I love. So it was always that little small opportunity I got in the beginning to go to the National Academy, and I was probably ranked 20 out of 20, but that opportunity then kind of gave me the opportunity to progress and have the pathway that I did. So although I fell short of the line occasionally, I always had to remain appreciative of the initial opportunity at the beginning. And I think sports has moved on massively, and it's a really interesting one, especially within the sport of judo, which is personal to me. I see a lot of the athletes a lot more empowered now to make the right choice for them, and they're not kind of continuing because they feel like they have to. I mean, I'm not going to obviously mention names, but there's some quite high profile judo players that actually made the decision to kind of take a step back for their own kind of well-being, and for so that they were kind of benefiting from that. And for me, that was a real brave decision. And actually, I think that the culture within sport, if that had happened 10 years ago even, which is quite recent, that would have been like, what's going on? But actually it was kind of not only I suppose not looked upon like that, but it was actually supported, and they're getting a very different reaction from potentially what you would have had 10 years ago. So I'm just pleased that those that are kind of coming behind and those that have the opportunity now, I kind of keep both fingers crossed that they kind of have a much better experience in that regard, and not feel those kind of lows when they get cut from funding and feel like they're not. I mean, like Louise, I was really fortunate to have kind of a not a backup plan, but my club and my support structure was strong. I wasn't within centralized training anyway, so when I got cut, I had my own team around me, and it was a real personal thing. And I think that's why we all do sport. It's your kind of personal belief that I had an unshakable belief that I hadn't reached my potential, and I was going to try with all the powers and with all the stuff that I had to kind of be the best that I could be, irregardless of the decisions that were remained around me. So it was really just me focusing on me, controlling the controllables. Don't get me wrong, it might have been an awful lot easier if you'd been funded, potentially. Who knows? We haven't got the crystal ball, to kind of say how my life would have panned out. But I've definitely learned so much more from kind of going on that pathway, and had loads of opportunities that I probably wouldn't have taken had I had the luxury of being full-time funded and not worrying about, I don't know, what the YST was an opportunity that I took, very small opportunity that I took alongside training, as well as working with some other sponsors that gave me real life work experience. So it's actually potentially been really beneficial. But for me, I'm really pleased. There was a quote that one of the judo coaches said: if you're not enough without the medal, you'll never be enough with it. And I'm sure he's probably stolen it from somewhere.
That's a great quote.
But I really like, that's really good. I'm gonna get that on a t-shirt, Tom. Send it over to me. We'll take that one. True though, like that, because I think you've just said many things that resonate with me. But I think the one thing I would just pull from what Tom just said was that support system is so crucial. And a bit of advice I would really give to people is really do surround yourself with the right people that love you and care for you. And actually, like, do you know what's hilarious is when I went out for my retirement, my closest friends all messaged me and went, I've still never seen you play tennis and don't understand the rules, but I'm really happy for you. when are we going out for dinner, when are we catching up? Because you know what, they weren't really that bothered. They were my biggest cheerleaders. They were the ones that would message me when I'm away, checking in. But actually, Paralympian or not, trophy or not, they just didn't make any difference. And that quote you just said kind of like reminds me of that, because actually, and that's how we should feel about ourselves, you know. And I think, I think please don't feel defined as a person by your results.
Can we edit that one last bit? Sorry. And I've got a quote about that I thought of long and hard, and the quote was from me, and it was. If you're not enough without the medal, you'll never be enough.
That's excellent. Well, thank you both for sharing those experiences on that. And it was wonderful actually to hear Tom, you talk about, athletes feeling now more empowered. The system is maturing, and athletes now have their voice. And I know last night's session with Will actually was about athlete voice and how athletes can use their voice and be empowered through their voice. And that actually brings me on quite beautifully. It was almost as if we rehearsed this team, to sort of understanding yourself, understanding the choice, and then framing it. And a lot of what you have both talked about in those examples is being really sure of yourself and what matters to you, being clear about the consequences of choices and that there are choices, and making them, taking a conscious role in it, and then framing that choice. Once it's made, you go with it and you live with it. So I just thought it might be quite interesting to explore a model. I'm going to let you all spend some time after this just reflecting. I'll stop the presentation. You can spend some time just reflecting on this model. So here's a graph with two axes, control axes from very little control to lots of control, and a responsibility axis from very little responsibility to lots of responsibility. And if you overlay this with maybe some of the things that might be relevant to an athlete, so the sort of things that we have control over and can absolutely take full responsibility for might be things like the hours of sleep we get, our sleep habits, our diet, and our training. Whereas things that we might not have a lot of control over, but have some responsibility for managing, might be the things like, for example, injury, the opposition. You know, we can't control the opposition, but we can certainly do our research on the opposition and understand how they perform, get inside their head, as it were. Same with our friends and family. We can't control them, but we can take some responsibility for talking to them, as we talked about with Tom's mum, in listening to them. And the way this model unfolds for me is we can kind of put ourselves into 4 of the quadrants. So we could consider ourselves sometimes to have absolutely no responsibility for something and no control, and therefore feel utterly helpless. And there might be situations you find yourself in where you do feel like that. You do feel like everything is happening around you and you don't have a voice in it, and it's absolutely impossible for you to grasp a hold of responsibility. But given what we're talking to you about today, I'm hoping that some of the experiences from Tom and Louise will help you avoid ever being in that situation. The next one is a careless situation, where actually you have lots of control, but you take no responsibility for it. I might say you're maybe a lazy athlete because you're ignoring some of the things that are fundamental to your performance. Therefore, you're being pretty careless. And if that's you, if you're recognizing that space, then maybe there are some things you need to think about while you're here with us at the games and going away about how serious you are about pursuing your sporting career further. But those things on the right-hand side, I believe once you're in the right frame of mind, we can either have some empowerment over, feel some ownership over, even if it's reactive. So taking responsibility for things out of our control often means we have to be agile, we have to be thinking, we have to be constantly reacting to what happens around us. But we are reacting. We're not just letting it wash over us as we would do in the helpless quadrant. And obviously the best place we want to be is proactive. We want to be taking control of as much of the territory around us in our performance as we can, and being responsible for it. So just think of yourself and maybe some of the things and how you manage your lifestyle. I'm not going to ask you, Tom, Louise, to put yourselves in quadrants. I'm sure at different times in your career, there'll be scenarios or ways in which you've moved through that. But what I'm going to give us now is I'm just going to stop the presentation, or allow you to stop the presentation, and just have a bit of a think on some of the things we've been through. So the first thing is, you know, do you see the decisions you have to make around the competing demands you face as choices that are positive choices because you prioritized a particular outcome? Or do you see them as sacrifices? Are they things you're missing out on? And if they fall into that sacrifice category, then there's a possibility you might regret or begrudge your decisions. So knowing yourself and knowing how these things feel will help you determine really whether the next step in your career as a performance athlete is for you. Secondly, you know, you might want to brainstorm some of those competing demands, because the starting point for all of this is planning. If we fail to plan, then we're going to plan to fail. So getting some of this information out of your head logically on paper allows you to analyze and think through it. And then finally, just using that last graph to think about, are you taking responsibility for as much as you can, and even the things out of your control, are you trying in some way to react positively to them and put yourself in the very best place? So we'll just stop the presentation there. So we're going to move in now to section 2 after that period of reflection. And this section, as I said, is going to be focusing much more on the theme of well-being. Very high profile at the moment, the consideration of athlete well-being, and importantly, those decisions that both Louise and Tom have talked about, where athletes have on occasion taken decisions, used their voice, taken ownership for what's right for them and their well-being. And that's been because they've prioritized their well-being over perhaps performance at a particular moment in time or a competition. But in order for us to get into well-being, the first thing we just need to understand is what well-being is and what it means. And I've just highlighted here World Health Organization Constitution definition, which is all about a state of complete physical, mental and social well-being. So our well-being is made up of how we're feeling, our health, our physical health, our functional capacity, our mood, our outlook, how relaxed we are, how happy we are, and also how much support we have around us. That's very much that social well-being. And again, Louise and Tom have both spoken about that. I'm going to come back to my scales, my weighing scales that we used in the first section of the session, and get you to think about the balance between the demands on you physically, emotionally and socially, and therefore the impact of sport on your life. How do all the demands you face as a young athlete impact on your life? But also then the impact of your life on your sport, and how you can build a resource bank and gather together resources around you to help balance out. So when we're facing all sorts of demands, if we have the resources to deal with those demands, we can balance the scales and keep our well-being. If our demands outweigh our resources, then we're in an imbalanced situation. Where we want to get to is tipping the scales so that the resources we have available to us are more than our demands. And what I mean by this is if we just think about, take the left-hand side for a minute, the physical, emotional and social demands of a young athlete. What might they be? Well, the physical demands, I should think, are pretty obvious to you. Things like your intensity of training, the complexity of some of the skills that you're learning how to perform and perfect. Demand might be dealing with an injury or dealing with a weakness somewhere in your physical condition that puts an extra demand on you. Whether you're a team sports player, you might be a hockey player, and you might have really strong speed, but you may lack a little bit of flexibility, and that can put demands on you as you try and power up the pitch. You put extra load on some of those muscles and soft tissue that are likely to be injured. Your emotional demands are often created by the mismatch between expectations, your expectations and those around you. You might be worried about competition, you might be fearful of a certain opponent, creates all these sorts of emotional anxieties. It might be you feel isolated, and that links into your social well-being. And you have people around you, as Louise said, you have that right team around you who love you for who you are and are interested in you as a person, or are they interested in you as a commodity and a medal performance. The resources on the other side, I guess, physical resources, sleep, diet, again, training to build capacity. Your emotional resources, things like resilience and self-confidence and a real knowledge of yourself and who you are. Being able to really put your finger on why you do sport and what it is that drives you and what it is that makes you happy can give you an enormous amount of emotional reservoir of strength when you come under pressure. And then those social resources around you could be anything from friends, parents and carers, coaches, your physio, your teacher, a whole group around you of people that you can draw on to get those scales in balance. So just Tom and Louise, just thinking about those, on the physical side of things, Tom, what would have been your real demands as an athlete, the times when your physicality, your body was under real pressure, and how did you develop some resources or some capacity to cope with the strongest or the biggest demands that you had as an athlete? And then Louise, I'll come to you, just give you a bit of thinking time. Tom doesn't get much thinking time. Give you a little bit of thinking time, just thinking about the emotional side for you. Where did you struggle emotionally? When did you feel that you lacked most confidence? And then where did you draw on your experience or your inner passion to kind of help balance? So Tom, tell us about your physical demands and resources.
So for me, within the sport of judo, I kind of went back into it from juniors to seniors and decided to be world class. I had to kind of change weight categories. So for me, it was kind of that balance of being able to drop my body weight, but then also maintain power, strength, and obviously physical fitness. So it wasn't too detriment in that kind of performance area. So for me, I kind of looked at it quite scientifically, worked with my strength and conditioning coach. I was fortunate I was a senior by then at the academy, and we detailed a plan to do it kind of progressively, and then gradually worked out. So my biggest resources there were my strength and conditioning coach, and actually going to him with what we needed to achieve, and then working out a plan that was kind of much more long term rather than this drastic yo-yo kind of effect that led to me not the greatly reduced reduction in power. So I maintained some scores in fitness and strength whilst reducing body weight, so I could compete at a weight group that was more suited to me on the international stage.
That's a fascinating example, Tom, because I guess in your example there, you're clearly changing weight categories. But for some of the young athletes watching this broadcast today, their physical maturity and development are going to create those sorts of demands, aren't they? As you know, a growth spurt can reduce coordination, for example, at a certain point in your life, or your center of gravity moves. If you were a gymnast or an athlete that where balance was really important, it can kind of change. So that's a really interesting example of how your conditioning was your resource to help you counter some of the demands that you were facing with the change of weight category.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's like anything, there's so many changes that you can have, but it's kind of using the expertise that you've got around you, because by no means was I an expert in all those things scientific. So it was using the expertise around you and kind of really assessing what it is you want to achieve with it. So if you identify the problem and then do it methodologically.
Yeah, great. And taking responsibility for things that maybe in that situation you could control, but if it was a maturity, growth and development, it would be something that's out of your control, but you can still take responsibility for it. Louise, did you manage to come up with anything in terms of that, how you managed your scales, balance the scales emotionally?
Yeah, I think it does resonate a little bit with what I mentioned earlier, but Tom sort of hit the nail on the head really about, you know, everyone's got their expertise, and that can be in the emotional side of things too. So thinking about the emotional stuff for me, I think that is about having the right team. It's similar to what Tom said, the right team of people who get you, they get how your personality works and how to best coach you and support you to get the best out of you as an athlete. Even things like, the first thing that came to my mind was my sports psychologist, you know, so that was the best person for me. And I went through a few sports psychologists, they were all great, but it took me a while to settle with the right person, because he obviously just got me that little bit better and really knew how to get the best out of me. And I did a really good job at supporting me as an athlete and as a person. So I think it's just drawing on that really, because there are a lot of emotional and social kind of factors which will impact you and have big demands on you, even, you know, expectations within a team, you know, because even if you're in an individual sport, like, you know, Tom's an individual sport too, but we're still part of a team, you know, you're around a lot of different characters, that can be overwhelming and things like that. So it's just being aware of all those things, what works for me. And even things like coming up with, like, we had sort of like solutions, a little go-to. So my love is music, I had a playlist I went to. If it was too much, that was my go-to, that was my resource. It was talking to my sports psych, it was drawing on those friends that are great. So I think it's just about, yeah, getting that balance and just being honest with yourself, what works for you. And just we have those resources.
And Louise, I want to just probe a little bit on this one, because you talked about trying lots of different sports psychologists, and that can be daunting in itself, can't it? Is again, another thing that athletes face in their career is having to say no to some people because they're just not right for you, whether that's a coach, whether that's a psychologist, whether that's a physio. Talk through, for the young athletes listening, how do you do that? How do you do that in a way that I guess protects you from any sense of loss that they might feel? They might have their nose put out of joint. Because how do you do that?
I think it's really difficult, and on a personal note, I'm somebody that the thought of offending someone or upsetting someone is like my worst nightmare. So it's something that I personally found quite difficult to do. And it's not just as a sports psychologist, you know, you may go through multiple coaches or fitness trainers or whatever. But I think at the end of the day, if you want to make it and you have your goals set in place, you have to be really strong and go, is this the best person to get me there? Because that person will be the best person for somebody else, because we're all different. So I think you have to really go, but are they for me? No. Okay. So I need to have that conversation and explain why. And I think, truthfully, I've had really good experiences in that the people I've worked with, I think we need to remember, like, okay, sometimes people do get offended and don't understand as much, but majority of people in that field, especially when you're talking about psychology and things like that, get that. They understand it. They understand the difference of personalities. So if you went to them and goes, look, I really like you, I think you're great, but actually for me this isn't quite working, I pretty much guarantee they're probably maybe feeling the same thing, because they'll know, they're in their field, they're experts, that they get it if you click and if you don't. It's no different to a friendship, right, or relationship. So for me, it was just about, it was like something I had to like find some bravery within me, because like I say, I hate that. But actually, I wanted it so much that I was like, is this the best person to get me there? I'm not sure it is. So I'm going to look elsewhere and be really honest with them. And actually, it was always a nice experience. And they were totally understanding, because I think as long as you articulate yourself in the right way and are honest, what more can you be but honest, really?
Yeah.
So
I guess we shouldn't forget that they want you to succeed as well, whether they want their athletes to succeed. If you're working with them and it's not working, that's not successful for them either. So I guess there's also a trade.
Don't forget, they're in the sport world too. You're so right.
Yeah. That's
all they're after too. They're after success and helping people be the best they can be. And yes, they want to do the best they can. So I honestly, I would honestly just say, be honest. You've got to prioritize yourself, your goals, and you've just got to be honest. And I would like to, I feel like I can commit to saying, I think majority of the time you'll get an understanding response, but just be honest and don't let things drag on longer than they need to, because that's time you'll never get back.
Thank you, Louise. Really good bit of advice. Hope you don't mind me putting you on the spot there for a minute. So just moving a little bit on from well-being, because quite a lot of what's been talked about recently is mental health. And when we're talking about well-being, we're talking about that rounded, holistic sense of health and happiness. But when we move into mental health, we start to experience a range of symptoms which go beyond a negative well-being state and into perhaps a poor mental health state. And this continuum has been taken from the English Institute of Sports, Maintaining Positive Mental Health Resource. So there's a little bit of something to follow up on after the session for you if you're interested in this. But just reading across here, why I've put this up is I think it's really important that we can, I guess, hold that mirror up to ourselves again and recognise when our behaviour is changing, when our emotional state is changing, and when things are starting to get a little bit further away from us and our ability to balance the scales, i.e. the further to the right of this continuum we are, probably the scales have become imbalanced, and it doesn't matter now how much you try and draw on your resources, but you're on a slippery slope and you need some more help. And to that end, we've seen as recently as the last few weeks and months in sport. Examples across Simone Biles. You'll I'm sure be all familiar with her decision to step out of some of the disciplines in the gymnastics because she was experiencing a real problem being able to locate her body in space. She just didn't have that proprioception that she normally has and felt it was a danger to her well-being to compete. We've got Ben Stokes from the world of cricket, who's taken himself away again just in the last month from performing at the highest level of Test cricket. Not exclusively from bereavement, but we do know that he tragically lost his father recently, and I think that's compounded his sense of mental health and positive well-being. And then Naomi Osaka again was in the news around the Olympic Games, but also around the Grand Slams, where media pressure and anxiety for her being the media. So there are some examples here where athletes have gone beyond having the resources to be able to draw on and balance those scales and have needed to go for some extra help. And it's not just a recent phenomenon, although this has been in the press recently. You know, there are a number of athletes going back to Michael Phelps, then Kelly Holmes, Andrew Flintoff, all who had different issues, not necessarily arising from their sport, although Kelly's very much about the injuries that she faced, but issues that recognise these are athletes living alongside their sport with a normal life and the normal pressures and demands that fall on all of us. So I'm conscious of time, and I'm just going to ask Louise and Tom one final question on this particular section, and then I'll go on to do the education section after that. But Louise and Tom, just in terms of the amount of scrutiny now and public debate and dialogue around athletes' mental health, do you think this is overall a positive thing? Is there anything that worries you about what you've seen, particularly in as I say, the last month or so, with those examples from Naomi Osaka, Simone Biles? You know, is there anything you think is a worry, or is this all a good thing that this is out in the open?
I think it's almost a little bit of both. Obviously, I really feel for those athletes, and it obviously concerns me a little bit because I'm gutted to hear they felt that way and had those struggles. But I think talking about it and it being an open conversation is absolutely brilliant. And I think we all need to hear more about it. And I love the honesty. And Tom sort of mentioned this briefly earlier, but I quite like that we're now in a place where it is coming out. People do feel like they can mention it. They can talk about it because it really normalizes it. Like we've mentioned already, you know, we're human beings. I think athletes sometimes are perceived to be robots, and actually we're human beings that have the same struggles, emotional difficulties, whatever it may be. There's a long list that everybody else on the planet does too, and it's actually okay to talk about it and go, it's too much for me right now, I'm taking a step back. So I think it's great. I just obviously really feel for those athletes because I don't wish that upon anybody, of course.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but it's giving permission. It's almost empowering, isn't it, to other athletes who might feel like that, to feel confident enough to take a step back from training or competition. And indeed, I suppose in many ways these athletes are acting as brilliant role models for the rest of society, as they're showing huge courage, which for other people who may not be athletes and may not have a platform which to talk about it, but it just gives them the confidence to come out. Do you agree, Tom?
Yeah, it's really interesting because I think I can only talk about my personal experience, but when I first heard about kind of these people taking a step back from the opportunity to kind of go to the Olympics and medal at the Olympics, where I thought it was definitely a really, really strong chance, I kind of, my own personal perspective was like, I would have given everything to have that opportunity and done anything within my power. And kind of once I took a step back and really kind of tried to take it all in, I was then thinking that actually it was a really, really good thing, and that they were empowered to be able to do to make the right choice for them in that moment. And I suppose the more we talk about it, the more people will feel confident in making the right decision for them, and I suppose not being, I suppose, really, I don't know, I suppose not being really reliant on the powers that be to give them the funding, because they're going to get the support that they need. And I think that's the best thing about it, because as we normalise the conversation, I think it only brings it to the forefront and actually means that the athletes that need it will get the help that they desperately need, which is only a good thing. I think all athletes potentially then even struggle with transition. So it's kind of like recognizing that conversation and making sure we're there to support them, and not this this fear of all or nothing. I've got to do it because otherwise, you know, not the world ends, but the kind of feeling of the world ending. So it can only be a good thing. But I kind of went full circle from thinking about it when it first came out to these, in my personal experience in recent months, not necessarily those ones that you've mentioned, but it's definitely a really good thing that it's now mentioned, and actually they're getting the help that they can need. And
you can kind of understand completely, Tom, with your initial emotion there, because, you know, one of the big challenges in mental health is it's invisible. Often it is invisible, not perhaps if you really overcome and you break down, but unlike a physical injury, which we all understand, someone's got their leg in plaster, they got to rest, they can't compete. The mental injuries or the mental health challenges we can't see. So unless people talk about them and verbalize what they're going through in their experiences, it's not understood and it's not kind of recognized and appreciated. So your journey there, from just hearing on the surface and stepping back, and then when the athlete starts to tell a little bit more about their story, you know, then Kelly Holmes, injury after injury after injury, just at the crucial moments, you know, she's talked about that leading her to self-harm because she hated her body so much. You know, if you hear that story, there's absolutely no way that anyone's going to challenge or dismiss that condition. So I'm just going to finish on a little positive on this, and then Tom and Louise, I'll let you go and I'll finish off and do the education last segment without you. I'll undoubtedly miss you, but to let you get back to your other duties. So just the last message on this mental health space and this well-being space is, what I did love about Tokyo were all the images of Tom Daley doing his knitting. And knitting for him was his release valve. It was, you know, you saw shots of him sitting in the bleachers in the diving arena, just doing his knitting between his dives. That was kind of his release valve for all that stress and anxiety and pressure building up inside him. And again, wasn't that lovely that everybody acknowledged that that's okay, and it's not something that isn't appropriate for an athlete to do knitting if that's what helps him distract. And Louise, you talked about having your playlist. That's, you know, relaxing, got you going. So I love that we are seeing the whole journey of mental health now. People expressing how they feel, we're seeing how they're handling it, and then we're seeing them come through it and perform brilliantly as a result of having managed the situation. So for anyone listening to this today, you know, if you are starting to struggle, think about that continuum, recognize your movement along the continuum. If you've drawn on all the resources you can and you're still feeling that you're struggling, ask for help, ask for support, find your safe place where you can get support, and hopefully get further resources or specialist resources to help you come back and be even stronger and more successful afterwards. So I'm going to finish it there on section 2. Say thank you to Louise and Tom for your fantastic contributions. Your honesty, openness, sharing your personal stories is everything that we need at the Games here. I always call this the School of Games, not just the School Games, it's the School of Games. If you wanted to learn how to become an elite athlete, you'd go to the School of Games, and that's what we've had this evening with your input. So thank you both ever so much. So we'll pause there, and then we'll give you some opportunity again just to reflect on that conversation. Maybe have a conversation with the person next to you, perhaps, about how you're feeling on your emotional demands and your emotional resources, and then maybe have just a bit of a reflection on that mental health continuum, whether you see yourself moving up and down it and managing to cope with it, or whether you recognise in yourself or others that slipped the wrong way. So thanks, Tom and Louise. We'll stop the video and then we'll start again with session 3 in a little while. So we're now just going to take a second break and give you the opportunity to reflect on the well-being section of this Life Alongside Sport session, and physical, social, emotional well-being, the demands, the resources you have available to you, that continuum of well-being and mental health, where we slide away from being able to control and support our emotional well-being with the resources available to us, and we start to decline and need more specialist help and sports. And then finally, just reflecting on those courageous athletes who are speaking out about their mental health and helping everybody understand that physical health and mental health are linked, and athletes cannot perform at their best if they are struggling with mental health issues, all of which bodes well for the continued development of our performance system and enabling athletes really to be the very best that they can be. So we're now going to move on to the third and final section of this Life Alongside Sport workshop. And as I mentioned at the start, this third section is on education and employment. And I want to talk about three particular elements to it. The first one being the timeline ahead of you for both your education and your sports performance journey. So what's on the screen here is an analogy, a road with various milestones on it. And the reason I put this up is if you think about now where you want to get to in your sport, what is your ultimate goal? Is it to be in the national team? Is it to compete at Commonwealth Games, Olympic, Paralympic Games? Do you want a medal? Games, where is that destination you're heading to? Once you have that destination, it's very possible, and indeed quite important, to then identify the milestones that would take you from where you are now to there. So if it is a Commonwealth Games or Olympic or Paralympic Games that you strive to, which games and when in which year? And then pair back to things like selections, competitions you would need to perform in, training camps. And alongside that, on the same roadmap to be putting those important milestones in your education, whether that is completing your GCSEs and your BTECs if you're not at that stage yet, your sixth form education or college education if you intend to go on to higher education, when your exams might be, etc. So it's really, really important that we have a line of sight of both of these things together. And Tom gave a perfect example earlier on of where he mentioned that he had slowed down his academic studies in order to allow him to train and compete at a time when he was at his fittest and healthiest. So it didn't mean he had to stop his education. He simply deferred it and delayed it. And that can be done when you take responsibility, you control the controllables, and you communicate with people around the needs and what it would take to enable you to do that. So I would encourage you all, no matter how lofty or not lofty your sporting ambition is to think about your sport career and your education or employment career and when those key milestones are ahead of you. And then on top of thinking about the roadmap to that destination point, if we are going to study for a college education or perhaps higher education, or we're going into employment, we do need to think about where that is, geographically where that is, and also where that is in terms of the attitudes and policies of those employers or education institutions to performance sport. So these are things, again, if you are serious about taking your career to that highest level, you'll need to take responsibility for controlling some of the controllables. And while I would always encourage you to be very clear in your education about what you want to study and why, there will often be more than one option. So geographically, does the institution have the facilities you need, or is it near enough to a facility that you require for your sport performance? Are there coaches locally? Do you need to be near your current squad, or is there another squad you can be a part of? What are the transport links like, enabling you to get to competitions and maybe travel to other hubs of performance if you need to? So all of those things should be factored into your decision making where possible around your education or employment. And here are some great examples. We've talked about Tom, but got great examples where Dina was able to go and study for her degree at King's College London right alongside her training commitments. Whereas Amy Williams, you may know Amy is a skeleton, Bob Skeleton athlete and gold medalist. She chose to study at the University of Bath because it was the only academic institution with a push start track for bobsleigh at the time, and she chose to undertake a foundation degree there, which would allow her to train alongside her pursuit of her performance career. And then just this summer, we saw the Geographically twins and competing in Tokyo in the gymnastics, just after they'd taken their BTECs, and then they return home, and as you can see them there in that image, getting their results and achieving their distinctions in their BTECs. None of this happens by chance. It happens by an awful lot of planning and management, and the individual concerned, the athlete, taking responsibility and taking control and being really organised in the decision making and the choices that they make about where they go when they study and what support they'll need along the way. So my final piece of advice or point for reflection is, do you have an escape lane? So it's all very well mapping out this performance sport career or the next stage in your sporting journey, and making decisions which allow you to continue with your studies or defer your studies or study something specific which allows you to continue your performance career. But what if it all goes wrong? And I definitely don't want to tempt fate. It could all go wrong because of injury. It could all go wrong because you just reach your potential, and your potential is where you're going to end up. So what's your escape lane? And are there ways in which you can fulfill your ambitions and your dreams, even if it isn't in the way you imagined? And this is where there's some sense in my hosting this evening's session, because I was a young athlete, not as talented as you, but fairly talented in the sports that I played. And I reached a point where it was clear that was the maximum of my potential. I wasn't going to be any better. I wasn't going to get to go to an Olympic Games. I wasn't going to go and play netball at Wembley or all of the things that I dreamed of doing. But I tell you now, working for the Youth Sport Trust, I have had every opportunity to live out my ambitions and my dreams of sport. I didn't realise it at the time, but why I love sport so much is because of the difference it made to my life, to the way it made me feel, and to the way it enabled me to feel part of a community, a sense of belonging, and feel self-confident and happy in my life. And all of those things I thought were tied up with trying to be the very best athlete that I could be. And actually, those things are all transferable and could be fulfilled in a completely different career. So I've had the privilege of attending 4 Olympic Games, 3 Commonwealth Games, extraordinary experiences. I've been so privileged, none of them as a competitor, all of them as an administrator in sport. But boy, do I feel that I've achieved my dreams and my ambitions. So never forget that we need an escape lane. We need a plan B. And the better we know ourselves, as we've said all the way through this evening, and what it is that motivates us and drives us, and why we've been making the choices we have all of our lives, the more we understand that, the more likely you are to still be able to fulfill those ambitions, albeit in a slightly different way. So I hope that last section has been helpful to you. So our final point of reflection is just for you and your education. Do you have a plan? Are there things that we've highlighted this evening that you just haven't thought of, that you now need to reflect on? Are there people you need to talk to, take advice from? Is there more searching you need to do in order to respond to those questions I suggested? But most of all, keep focusing on what's in your heart and what's in your head and what drives you and what motivates you, because that's going to be so important in your sporting career, but it is also going to be so important in enabling you to fulfill a happy and successful life. So I'm going to finish with sharing some further follow-up content, both on the National School Games web platform, and they're on this slide deck for you. There are some clips and some readings which I hope you'll find helpful. I hope you've enjoyed this evening's session and there have been some things you can take away. I've certainly enjoyed talking to you, thinking about this session, and in particular talking to Tom and Louise this evening. So I wish you all the very best of luck for the rest of your time at the School Games National Finals 2021. If you haven't finished competing yet, good luck for tomorrow. And if you're watching this after the event, I hope you had a super time at the Games. You performed at your best when it mattered the most. But above all, you took away some important learning from the athlete education experience and the wider Games, which will help you go on to be even more successful in your sporting career and your life. Thank you.